Ocala's information station, 1370 WOCA.
Ocala.
Diamonds in the sunset, now your time has come.
All right, 5 minutes after 10 o'clock. Thank you for tuning in. The best way that I can introduce our next guest to you is to go back in time a little bit for you to my very first days working in radio. When I first started in radio, I was already 29 years old, believe it or not. And in other words, I wasn't one of those guys that started doing it right out of college. I actually was doing something else and started working in radio in 1984. That's how long ago that was. And of course, it was a music station. And then I went up and down a little bit on the dial, but there was this sudden move to do talk radio, and I did not have a talk radio show. In the beginning of talk radio, I was basically the guy who played the commercials and did everything but the talking. Because playing music was one thing, but talking politics was another. And you know why the boss didn't put me in front of the microphone to talk politics, Robin? You know why?
Why is that?
Because I had no clue. 29 years old. I know some of these young people today, and well, not just today, even back then, you know, I was just one of those that was just not really paying a whole lot of attention as I should have. But I learned the first time when the morning host had to take a break or go on a vacation, or he went somewhere, and they said, Larry, you're going to have to help out. Do you think you could talk politics? Like, Robin, I didn't know left from right. Literally. Yeah. I didn't know that the left was liberal, the right was conservative. And if I knew that, I wouldn't have known what it meant to be liberal or conservative or a libertarian, you know, or even Republican and Democrat. I mean, for me, it was all one big hodgepodge, and suddenly I was faced with the fact that I didn't know a whole lot about a whole lot. I could have used the next book that we're going to talk about. It would have been a really handy tool for me. I did find my share of books back then to try to cram.
Yeah.
But I remember being petrified talking anything politics and debating the politics. But that was then. This is now in 2013. That was so. How many years is that? 29, something like that. 29 years. David R. Young is on the phone, and I bet he's younger than I was. I bet he's younger than 29. I don't know. He's a businessman, a professional home designer, and happens to be a religious philosopher, and as you probably guessed, knows a little bit about politics. He's an advocate for the Constitution, and I learned, this is one of the first things I learned, that the best way to understand America is to understand the Constitution.
Yeah.
And that has been, if there's any one thing I can advise anybody who was in the same boat I was in 1984, learn the Constitution. The book he has written is really wonderful. It's called The Political Spectrum, Freedom versus Enslavement. And if you want to do a talk show, this is a good way to start, unless you've already got this under your belt. David R. Young. Good morning, David.
Good morning, Larry, and thank you for having me on. And good morning, Robin.
Good morning.
Where are you?
I'm in Clearwater, Florida.
How old are you?
I am perhaps about the same age as you. I was born in 55.
Oh, really? Okay. See, but I'm guessing that you were interested in this before I became interested in this. Am I right?
I would say no.
Oh, really?
That perhaps, yes. I would say that you were probably more interested in it than I was before and matter of fact, it was exactly 2012, and the exact thing that became interesting to me was that the people who were talking about freedom, individual responsibility, and the Constitution were referred to as fascists. And that's what got my interest, because I knew freedom and fascism were not the same thing.
Yeah, they're not. So there's now a book that you've written, and you obviously grasped it instantly. 2012. I mean, you must have been interested in this before last year.
Well, it's always been part of my interest, particularly as it regards to freedom. But it wasn't being involved in. I've always voted, by the way, so it's not that I've ignored politics. But it has been. It wasn't until 2012, the summer of 2012, when I sat down and I actually started researching. And what I did when I saw this, I said, there's something wrong with this political spectrum. With fascism on the right, communism on the left, where do you put freedom? on this spectrum.
Right.
Because I am also very familiar with, having done engineering, I'm very familiar with spectrums and what they consist of. And as an example, if you take what is actually the definition of a spectrum, it's basically a step-by-step scale between two opposite extremes. So an example of of these two extremes would be like black and white, right? And then all shades of the gray in between would be the spectrum. So a spectrum is a step-by-step scale between two opposite extremes. And that's really important to understand, because when you take the European political spectrum, it has that communism on the left and fascism on the right.
Right.
But both of these are a pathway to tyranny.
Yeah.
You see what I mean?
Yeah.
They're neither one of them have anything to do with freedom.
Well, and
so where do you...
I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I was just going to interject something. When we look at the far left and the far right, and we consider them extreme, and maybe some people are comfortable, but I'm not. I'm not comfortable. I can't broad brush anything. In other words, if you ask me about local politics, should we spend taxpayer money on a library? I might be a little bit more liberal than I might be on spending, taxpayer money on some other program, whether it's local or not. I think, and I'm very conservative when it comes to spending it, but I'm maybe not so conservative about some social issues. You know what I mean?
Exactly, and I'll tell you what the problem is that you're looking at. Is that, for instance, on this political spectrum, conservatism is on the right and liberalism is on the left, right?
Right.
But neither of these are actually political systems. They're simply attitudes toward the social or political issues of the day. So, for instance, there are liberal communists and there are conservative communists. There are liberal fascists and there are conservative fascists.
Right, and right now, what do you consider America? Do you think where are we on the spectrum, and what's the label that you put on us?
Well, our Constitution, as it was originally formed, was a republic, and that basically is a government based on freedom. Its whole concept, its whole idea of being created was to provide and protect the freedom and the inalienable rights of all citizens.
Right, right.
So when you look at that, you say, well, where does that fit on a scale, on a spectrum between communism and fascism? Well, it doesn't. So what I did was I studied communism and fascism very intently to really discover what they were, what their differences were, how they were opposed to each other, and they are opposed to each other. But when I looked at government from the viewpoint of me or any individual, it's like, well, what do we want from government, and what is it that we're trying to strive for? And really, we want government to protect our freedoms. We don't want it interfering with we don't want it dictating to us what we can and can't do. And so I started looking at, well, what is the real spectrum here? You have what is the real black and white of politics or political systems? And what I came up with at first was I was like, well, there's dependence and independence. Do you want to be dependent on your government, or do you want to be independent of your government and be able to, live your life and pursue happiness? And so when I looked at that, I went, okay, well, independence, dependence, that's pretty good, but what if I stretch that further? What are the extremes of that? And on the left, I went, okay, enslavement would be the most extreme form of government, and on the other side would be freedom, which would be the most extreme on the right. So now you can't have complete freedom, and you're not going to have complete enslavement, but those are the extremes. And from that, you start working it back, and you start looking at every single political system, and you say, okay, well, where does each political system fit on this spectrum of freedom to enslavement? And now you have the real left and right, because the danger of the political spectrum we have right now is that when people start talking about freedom, and they're talking about the Constitution, which really is the extreme right of the political spectrum, and then they're being referred to as fascists, then people don't want to stand up.
Well,
Up for these
I
things.
think that's a false label, though, to call them fascists. I think, okay, getting back to the question of where America stands in the spectrum, we have a lot of social programs in America, which makes some of the well, I'll just say some of the listeners, some of the callers that call the radio show, they will say we are slowly becoming a socialist country, and they have some good points about that. But we've got some social programs that you could argue in your spectrum discussion about the far extreme being enslavement and the other far extreme being absolute freedom. Well, if we are having social programs and that takes us back a few notches from absolute freedom, then we sacrifice, I guess, tax money. That's the only thing I can figure here. And that's where the freedom, in other words, we're not free to keep our money. So therefore,
right.
But we're not as captive as you would be if you lived in England.
Exactly. And let me clarify that point then, because you said something very astute there. The idea of it being absolute freedom. Well, there isn't absolute freedom in any society. If you look at what human rights are, unalienable rights, those basically say what your freedoms are as an individual. But look at it this way, there are also restrictions on you, because you have to then grant those exact same rights to every other individual, no matter his race, color, culture,
that's right,
creed.
Which means you don't have the freedom to kill anybody, and you don't have the freedom to steal from anybody. That's
exactly.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. Yeah.
You see what I mean? So it's not like when we say freedom, it's a complete anarchy of no agreement, no control, no policy, nothing. And if you just use those human rights or unalienable rights as a guide and say, okay, these are my freedoms, but they're also every other individual's freedoms, then that kind of tells you how far you can go with your personal freedom.
The only thing is that everybody loves freedom. And if the absolute opposite was true, in other words, total enslavement, well, that means that somebody is the slave master. And guess what?
Exactly.
That's under absolute enslavement, the slave master has absolute freedom. Because he
got it perfectly.
Because he's got the freedom to kill you if he wants to.
Yeah.
Exactly. So let's look at communist Russia of the past, right? They murdered or imprisoned all their political opposition. They built barbed wire fences and walls, not to keep immigrants from sneaking in and enjoying this wonderful place, but to keep their own people from escaping. And all property, production, labor were all owned and controlled by the Communist Party. So communism enslaved its populace. So it would follow that the extreme right of the political spectrum is government which recognizes and supports the inalienable rights of the people it governs. In other words, it's a government built on freedom.
Right. If we let me ask you something, David. If we could take your illustration of a spectrum of the black and white spectrum, if we could take that illustration and mark it from 1 to 100, let's say, 1 being the darkest and 100 being the brightest, the whitest.
Right.
And then we were to place it somewhere on planet Earth, because planet Earth spins, and we go from absolute darkness in the middle of the night to absolute daylight in the middle of the day. Mm-hmm. So you have 100 points between midnight and noon.
Yep.
And darkness being, I guess, the enslavement, and brightness being total freedom. Where are we? What time is it?
Yeah.
Well, we're
question.
sliding. Okay, I would say that the halfway point between, let's just take the middle of those two extremes.
It'll be 6 a.m.
Is democratic socialism is the halfway point between those two. We are sliding down toward democratic socialism. And
yeah, I think you're right.
Some people may say this is a wonderful system because it cares for everybody, but it doesn't care for everybody. And it stifles
Absolutely.
Those who are creative, productive. So the spectrum that I laid out actually lays out 5 different points on that spectrum. There's obviously many, many more political systems that could be finally stuck. For instance, communist China, where do you put communist China? Well, they were communist, now they're moving more to the right, more of a fascist society now, because they're building up their military. They're allowing some freedoms that communism never allowed, but they're still very much in control and very strictly controlling, production and what happens in China. So, but they've slid from the left a little bit more to the right. They allowed a little bit more freedoms, you see, as they let the free market evolve.
Do you think that the United States could survive without political parties at all, that people should just run and just run because they're a person and whatever they believe in, instead of having this tag on them that they belong to this party and they belong to that party, therefore they're going to follow this regiment and not even consider the other regiment?
I think that's a really good question. I think because most people don't understand politics and don't even understand what their party is doing, I totally agree with that assessment. If people just looked at the Constitution as the supreme law of the land, which is what it is, and then they looked at that and they said, well, how does this politician stack up against that? Because what happens is you get more. I'll tell you what, let's back up for a second. Between a republic and democratic socialism is another system that everyone's familiar with, but aren't really in the point where they really understand it, which is democracy. You keep hearing that America is a democracy, and we're not a democracy. Democracy is majority rule. It's mob rule. Majority basically sets the laws. That's a democracy. And so, and as an example, Jefferson said that democracy was where 51% of the people could take away the rights of 49% of the people. And that's what democracy is. And what happened was our republic, which was not set up as a democracy, has slowly slid down into a democracy. The senators, the U.S. senators, at one time were elected by the state legislatures. They were the ones who put the senators in office, and they were there to protect the states' rights. And the populace voted for the House of Representatives. So you sent your representatives there, the state sent their representatives there, and then the president was supposed to be just simply elected by the Electoral College, which actually wasn't called that at the time, but that's who was supposed to elect the president.
Right.
It wasn't a popular vote. So what's happened over the 200 years we've been here is that our Constitution has been altered to the point where now the senators are a popular vote. President is a popular vote, though it does still have the Electoral College there. But it's also, if you look, there's movements to get rid of it. Once that's done, we're actually a democracy. We're no longer a republic.
There you go.
So we slid down.
Yeah,
We slid down.
Yeah, I don't disagree.
Right? So,
yeah.
So we slid down into democracy. We're almost at a point where we are a democracy, but we're not supposed to be a democracy. It doesn't guarantee freedoms for the minority.
No, we're a democratic republic.
Exactly.
The movement you referred to get rid of the Electoral College is something that every single presidential election cycle, we have that debate on this radio show, and always have authors on both sides. And I've never really, I cannot be convinced that we should get rid of it. I still believe it is some great wisdom of somebody way back when who decided that we should have that system, because it makes more sense to me. The way it was explained to me is that if we didn't have it, then my vote wouldn't matter at all, because I live in a little tiny area.
Exactly.
It wouldn't matter at all.
Do you think that... Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. I was going to say
Go ahead.
I'm sorry,
go ahead.
Well, here's the danger of a democracy. It's that obvious thing that once the majority can figure out that they can vote for people who will give them handouts, that's when you start sliding down into the democratic socialism. So now, once you have a full democracy and there's no way to stop that movement, then it's a swift slide right down into socialism. Now, the danger of that is that the next system below democratic socialism is fascism. And it's an interesting thing. This was one of the most interesting things I found in my research. And when I studied Mussolini, and I was like, why did he create this? And he created fascism to stop and oppose socialism and communism. And everyone who had their stuff taken away, Europe was like sliding into communism, socialism, and fascism rose and said, no, we're not going to take it anymore. And they used force, and they killed people. And you see what I mean? They went away from the concepts of freedom and human rights, and they went into this the state is more important than anybody. And so if you don't support the state, then you're an enemy of the state, and you either get imprisoned or you get executed.
You're done. David R. Young is our guest. His book is called The Political Spectrum, Freedom versus Enslavement. We do the show live, David, and that means our listeners often will call in, and I've got somebody waiting patiently, I hope.
Great.
Thank you for being so patient. You're on the air with David Young.
Good morning, Mr. Young. My name is Sonny. I'm
morning.
calling in about everything you're saying is true, with the exception that I think we have a different system. Yes, they call it a two-party system, but I don't see two parties. I see one party run by the big-time businesses, contributors, lobbyists, etc., etc. Both parties do nothing to upset the money wagon, and that makes them one party. I.e., example, I honestly believe the Democratic Party and the Republican Party have been playing good cop, bad cop with the American people ever since Barry Goldwater ran against Lyndon Baines Johnson in, I believe, 1964. And to my way of thinking, this can be witnessed by the various things that have taken place with the, i.e., let's take the big immigration deal signed by President Reagan in 1986. If you read that whole bill, this country would be totally different, because we would realize, or the government would realize, that a lot of people want to come here because they have the freedom of making it on their own, whereas you don't have that in other countries. I'm not saying freedom of democracy, because I don't think we have a democracy. But anyway, they legalized 11 million at that time, and then threw the rest of the bill under the bus, such as your securing the border, stopping all immigration until they found out who was supposed to be here and not supposed to be here, and securing our ports, terminals, and like. And then opening up for proper immigration to this country. Both the Republicans and the Democrats have thrown that bill out the window, and here we are going through the same nonsense all over again, and they're still saying it's only 11 million. Well, if you take the state statistics for indigent care, et cetera, you come up with a figure like close to 40 million. And anyway, I would like your comment on that, and I do think this, you're hitting on a lot of stuff other than the fact that we don't have a two-party system as far as I'm concerned. I'll hang up and listen. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonny. David, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, unfortunately, he was right in every aspect of what he said, and it is unfortunate. And the problem here is that the party system was never intended. That was an added thing.
I agree.
If we were to simply just go back to the basics of the Constitution, and we get rid of the arbitrary laws that have been created, the arbitrary amendments that have been put on there, like the 17th Amendment, which allowed senators to be a popular vote, and also the banking system. Now, you mentioned that a lot of this is because of big business and what have you, but truthfully, behind all of that is the international banker, the Federal Reserve, and the IRS. And I go into that in the book, and we probably don't have enough time to cover that, but Thomas Jefferson was an enemy to central banking. He said that central banking, if it were to be imposed, then Americans would one day wake up and find out that their homes, their country, had been sold out from under them, and they would have lost the freedoms that had been so bravely fought for. And I am extremely passionate about this whole concept of the Federal Reserve and the IRS and what they do to our country, because they are the disease behind the decay of our country. So, yeah.
All right, hey, David, you're doing all right. Let me squeeze in one more phone call. Somebody's been waiting, and then we'll give out information so people can get the book. And I have a copy of the book if you want to just call me and ask for it. The rest of us will have to go buy it. First, let's take this last phone call. Good morning. Thank you for being patient. You're on the air with David Young.
Good morning, Mr. Young. I'm glad you did touch on, but you just did it briefly on the question that Robin asked in regards to the two-party system. You're exactly right. The Constitution, when we first started, it wasn't even, you didn't have to be a member, and nor does it even mention in the Constitution, you don't have to be a member of a party to run for any political office. That's something that sort of was thrown in as we evolve, but I'm glad you did briefly touch on it, because there are a number of people that are under that misconception that we always had the two-party system. We did not. And I also agree with you in terms of the Federal Reserve, and in terms of what actually happens. It serves no one except big business with all this QE3 stuff. Maybe QE4 now, I don't know, but that doesn't serve the little guy at all, basically. As for the Electoral College, I have some concerns about that, but I'll hang up and enjoy listening to you.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
David, you want to
Thank you very much.
comment real quickly, and then we'll have to wrap it up? David?
I'm sorry?
Did you want to Did you want to comment, and then we'll wrap it up?
No, what
No?
he said was absolutely right.
Okay.
We're fine. Let's. I really appreciated his viewpoint and his comments, and I totally agree with what he said.
David, do you have a website that we can send our listeners to?
Yes, my website is thepoliticalspectrum.net.
Okay.
Thepoliticalspectrum.net.
And the word "the" has to be in there, right?
Yeah, thepoliticalspectrum, all one word, .net.
All right.
And the book, by the way, can be gotten on Amazon.com. That's a soft cover. And, of course, it's available in electronic form in both Nook, Kindle, and in iBooks.
Okay, excellent. Well, good for you. Thank you for doing this. Hey, I'm telling you, what I said in the beginning would really help anybody trying to do a talk show, especially if you're a newbie to talking politics. I mean, you've really laid out some of the different definitions. You've quoted some well-known people throughout history. Maybe not some people we like, but at least it explains how they felt and what their thoughts were on what we hold near and dear here in America, which is freedom. David, thank you for what you're doing. I think it's going to help a lot of people and perhaps change some. Maybe one day we'll get back to the no party system. Maybe one day we'll do that. David,
yes, perhaps.
Thank you so much for being on with us. Thepoliticalspectrum.net is the website. I just went to it. I'm looking at it. Thank you so much, David.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me on. Hi, Robin.
You're welcome. We'll take a break and be right back.
Hi, I'm Yvette, and I'm here to tell you a few things about ABC Fredericks Appliance. They sell not only new, but used guaranteed appliances. When you call ABC Fredericks Appliance, they will provide service on what they sell and any appliances that you own. ABC Fredericks Appliance is located in Bellevue, right over the railroad tracks. Call 352-629-5181. That's 352-629-5181. That's 352-629-5181. ABC Fredericks Appliance.
Car problems got you down? Having trouble getting that broken down clunker to the mechanic? D&D Towing has all your towing solutions to get you exactly where you need to go and back on the road again. D&D can tow your car, your truck,